I've always been fascinated by old things. There's something about vintage items that seem to carry stories, a sense of belonging to times long past. As my wedding day started to approach, I decided I wanted something special, something with history to wear on the big day. I didn't want a brand new wedding dress without any soul. That's when I remembered Facebook Marketplace, where I had found some great pieces before. I spent days browsing through listings until I finally found what seemed like the perfect dress. It was a 1940s style, full of delicate lace details and tiny pearls sewn by hand. The price was surprisingly low, which made me a little suspicious, but the photos were irresistible. The seller seemed legitimate, so I didn't hesitate and made the purchase. When the dress arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and curiosity. It was even more beautiful in person, but I quickly noticed something odd. As I pulled the dress out of the box, I was hit by a sweet, almost sickly smell, like the scent of flowers that had passed their prime and were starting to wilt. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just the smell of something that had been stored away for a long time. That night, I hung the dress in my room, where I could see it every time I looked over from my bed. Its presence there, wrapped in stories I would never know, should have filled me with a sense of magic and anticipation for my wedding day. But instead, I felt something else. A slight unease, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in the room. The first few days with the dress were uneventful, but soon things started happening, weird things to say the least. You know that feeling when something feels off but you can't quite put your finger on it? That was the sensation. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination. The dress was hanging in the room, and every time I looked at it, that odd feeling came back. It wasn't exactly fear, but it wasn't comforting either. Then one night I woke up suddenly. It was still early morning, everything dark, but I could have sworn I heard a noise. A soft sound like someone walking slowly through the room. I lay there, completely still, trying to figure out if it was real or just a strange dream. The problem was that the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I wrapped myself in the blankets and tried to fall back asleep, convincing myself that I was just tired, that it had been one of those normal house sounds, you know? But over the next few days, things got more intense. I'd leave the room in the morning, and when I returned, the dress wouldn't be exactly in the same spot where I had left it. It was just a little more tilted, or the sleeves were slightly stretched like someone had been messing with it. But no one besides me ever entered that room. I was uneasy, but I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, or maybe I had bumped into it without realizing. It was easier to believe that than to admit something strange was going on. But that presence lingered in the back of my mind. The feeling that something was wrong, that the dress wasn't just an inanimate object. It was impossible to ignore any longer. Things really started getting weird after one particularly strange night. I had a nightmare, one of those dreams that feel way too real. In the dream, I was wearing the dress. It fit perfectly, but it didn't feel right. I saw myself walking through an open field, but the ground was soaked like I was stepping in mud. With every step, the weight of the dress seemed to increase, like something was pulling me down. I tried to keep walking, but it was impossible. And then all of a sudden, I started sinking. First to my knees, then to my waist. The dress grew heavier and heavier, until there was only darkness around me. I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The worst part was when I looked to the side. The dress wasn't in the closet. It had fallen, or rather, it was sprawled across the floor, almost as if someone had taken it off and left it there. I froze, trying to make sense of what was happening. It didn't feel like a coincidence, you know? Something about that dress was wrong, but I was still trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination playing tricks on me. I decided to investigate. I searched online, trying to find anything I could about the dress's origins. I stumbled upon a site with old stories from the town, and to my shock, I found an article from decades ago about a bride who had disappeared on her wedding day. She was never found, but her dress was. Where? In the lake, floating adrift, just like in my dream. My blood ran cold. The description of the dress was identical, every detail matched. I was wearing a dress that belonged to a missing bride. And the scariest part? They said she was last seen near the lake, wearing the very same dress that was now lying in my room. After discovering the story of the missing bride, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. I could no longer look at the dress without feeling a growing sense of unease. It was as if, day by day, its presence in the house became heavier, more oppressive. I tried to ignore it, but the more I did, the worse it got. That night, I woke up with a suffocating sensation. I'm not sure how to describe it, but it felt like someone was holding me down, like invisible hands were pressing against my chest. The room was cold and the air felt thick, hard to breathe. And then I realized, the dress was on me. Somehow, it had gotten out of the closet and was now on top of my bed, wrapping around my legs and arms. It was as if it had a life of its own, trying to trap me. I panicked. I started pulling at it, desperately trying to free myself, but the fabric seemed stuck, like it was purposely tangled around me. My mind was racing. All I wanted was to escape that horrible feeling of being suffocated by something that should have been lifeless. After what felt like hours of struggling, I finally managed to yank it off me. I threw it to the floor with all the strength I had. Gasping for air, I backed away as far as I could, staring at it like I was expecting it to move on its own again. My entire body was shaking. There was no way I could ignore what was happening anymore. This dress wasn't just wrong, it was something evil. I sat there, leaning against the wall, trying to calm down. But one thing was clear: I needed to get rid of it. There was no longer any doubt that the dress was connected to the spirit of the missing bride. And it seemed like she wanted something from me, maybe even to take my place. After that night, I couldn't feel at ease in my own home anymore. The dress was in storage now, far from my bedroom, but the feeling that something was watching me never really went away. Canceling the wedding was the only decision that made sense at that point. It wasn't just the dress, it was everything. My mind was too much of a mess to think about celebrations or happiness. Something about that dress had changed everything. I tried to move on, but every time I walked near the storage room, I felt a chill, and that disturbing memory came flooding back. The smell of dead flowers seemed to linger, never fully disappearing. The nights were still difficult, filled with recurring nightmares, and although I never saw the dress move again, I knew the story wasn't over. Sometimes I wonder if the missing bride was trying to finish something unfinished, maybe her own wedding. Maybe that's what she wanted: a second chance, a body to inhabit, someone to complete what she couldn't. But the truth is, I never had the courage to get rid of the dress. It's still there, buried deep in storage, waiting. And honestly, I'm scared of what might happen if I try to dispose of it. Sometimes I still feel that invisible weight on my bed, like she's still here, waiting for the right moment. I've always loved hunting for hidden treasures online, and Facebook Marketplace became my favorite spot for that. Recently, I decided my living room needed a special touch, something to make it feel more welcoming. That's when, while scrolling through endless listings of used items, an oriental rug caught my eye. It was stunning. Intricately designed in shades of red and gold, the rug looked like it was made specifically for my space. The price, to be honest, was ridiculously low for something so well preserved. I was a bit suspicious, of course, but after contacting the seller, I decided it was an opportunity one couldn't pass up. The man, whose name was Carlos, seemed nervous but insisted the rug was in good condition. "It's got history," he said vaguely, like it was just an interesting detail. When I asked for more specifics, he quickly changed the subject, eager to close the deal. The next day the rug arrived. When I unrolled it in the living room, I felt an immediate sense of satisfaction. It was even more beautiful in person. It felt like I had finally found the missing piece to transform the house. The next day, as I was grabbing my morning coffee, I walked past the living room and noticed something odd on the rug. There was a stain in the center. At first, I thought I might have spilled something, maybe some coffee or juice, without realizing it. But this was a strange stain, dark and almost looked like a shadow. I grabbed a cloth and tried to clean it, but nothing. The stain wouldn't budge. I stood there scrubbing for a good while, and it seemed like the more I tried, the more it clung to the rug. I started to think maybe the rug had some issue from before, possibly an old stain the seller hadn't mentioned. Either way, I decided to let it go. It wasn't anything that ruined the rug's appearance, so I figured I'd just move on and not worry too much about it. At least that's what I thought at the time. A few days went by and I started noticing some strange things around the house. Nothing major, but the kind of stuff that makes you stop and think, did I do that? For example, one morning I left my keys on the kitchen table. Later, when I went to grab them, they were in the living room on the couch. Small stuff, right? But it left me puzzled. I figured maybe I was just distracted, forgetting where I'd left things. But then came the feeling that sometimes I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was watching me. I'd be watching TV at night, and out of nowhere, I'd glance over at the rug, almost expecting to see something. The stain, of course, was still there, unchanged. But now it seemed bigger? Maybe it was all in my head. I tried to ignore it, but that feeling was hard to shake. After a while, things started to get even stranger. It wasn't just that feeling of being watched anymore. I started having nightmares. Every night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. In the dreams, there was always a faceless figure standing in the middle of the living room, right on top of the rug. It didn't move, it just stood there staring at me, or at least it seemed like it was. That was really starting to get to me, putting my nerves on edge. The worst part was, beyond the nightmares, I started waking up in the middle of the night hearing noises. It was always at the same time, 3:33 a.m. I could swear I heard soft footsteps coming from the living room, like someone was walking around. But when I finally gathered the courage to get up and check, there was no one. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the rug. The stain now seemed even bigger. I can't explain it, but it was like the figure from my dreams was starting to take shape there, right in the middle of the rug. I kept trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was stress from work or just lack of sleep. But deep down, something told me it wasn't that simple. After so many sleepless nights and that unsettling feeling lingering around me, I decided I needed to do something. The first thing that came to mind was trying to get in touch with the seller again, that guy Carlos. I sent him a message asking if he knew anything about the rug. It took him a while to respond, but when he did, he was blunt. "I advise you to get rid of it." I found that way too strange. With no other options, I started doing some research online. It took a while, but I eventually stumbled upon a bizarre story about a house where an entire family had been murdered years ago. The crime scene photos showed a rug exactly like mine in the middle of the living room. Worse, the body of the killer was never found. Some believed his soul had been trapped in the house, or maybe now in the rug. I was dealing with something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. After discovering that gruesome story, I knew I couldn't keep the rug in the house. I decided to get rid of it once and for all. I dragged the rug out into the backyard and tried to burn it. I lit a fire, threw the rug on top, but no matter how much the flames grew, it wouldn't burn. It was like it was immune to the fire. That fear started to take hold of me. Then I felt a presence behind me. My heart was racing. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. Still, the feeling of being watched had never been so intense. Not knowing what else to do, I dragged the rug back inside. It felt like it was part of the house now, almost as if it was fused to the place in a way I couldn't explain. The nightmares lessened a bit, but that feeling, that something or someone was there with me, never fully went away. Sometimes at night, I still hear footsteps in the living room, always circling around the rug. And now, as I write this, I just heard them again. They sound closer this time. I'm no longer sure if I'm safe. Maybe I never was. I've always enjoyed browsing through Facebook Marketplace. Honestly, it was more of a pastime than a necessity. You know how it goes? You're bored and start looking for something you didn't even know you needed. And it was on one of those nights, while I was aimlessly scrolling, that I came across this book. It looked old, really old, with a leather cover that was a bit scorched, like it had been through a fire. That immediately caught my attention. It looked like one of those relics that holds a story full of mystery. The seller, an older gentleman, had set the price so low that it was impossible not to be interested. We arranged to meet the next day. When I got there, he seemed a bit rushed, almost like he wanted to get rid of the book as quickly as possible. Strange, but I didn't think much of it. He just looked at me, handed over the book, and before I left, he said something odd. "If I were you, I wouldn't keep that for too long." I didn't get it, but I laughed it off and went on my way. In my mind, it was just an old man trying to spook a buyer. If only regret could kill. I got home and placed the book on my nightstand. I didn't have much time to mess with it that night, but just having it there made me feel satisfied. It was like I had found some lost treasure. I decided to leave the reading for the next day and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I was suddenly woken up by a strange smell, like something was burning. I shot up, heart racing. I looked around the room thinking maybe a wire had shorted out, but everything seemed fine. After checking around the house, I went back to my room, and the smell of smoke was still hanging in the air. I didn't know where it was coming from, but it seemed to be weaker now. I started thinking maybe it was all in my head, maybe some weird dream had triggered the smell. After all, the book had burn marks on it. Maybe my brain connected the dots and played a trick on me. With that excuse in mind, I got back into bed trying to shake off the weirdness of it all. But that smell started showing up every night after that. Always right when I was about to fall asleep, there it was again. Still, I was convinced it was just my imagination. After a few days of waking up in the middle of the night to that smoky smell, I started to get uneasy. It wasn't normal, you know? Even though I kept trying to convince myself it was all in my head, I started paying closer attention. And that's when I noticed something even weirder. One afternoon, I was flipping through the book trying to figure out what made it so special. The pages were yellowed, some smudged with ash, but the text was still readable. But as I was turning the pages, I noticed something odd. Some of the words were different. It seemed like the text changed every time I opened the book. At first, I thought I was just tired and seeing things, but then I realized the words were forming sentences that made too much sense to be a coincidence. The words started describing things that were happening to me, the smell of smoke, the restless nights. It was like the book was telling my story. That made me uneasy, but still I tried to brush it off. I decided to do some research on the book, maybe find out where it came from. That's when I found out it had belonged to a woman who had died in a mysterious fire. And that's when things started to get really disturbing. The discovery about the woman who died in the fire left me shaken. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but with each passing night, it became harder to ignore what was happening. The smell of smoke grew stronger, almost as if the fire was right there inside the room. And the book, well, it didn't stop changing. The words kept shifting on the pages as if they were alive, telling stories that felt increasingly closer to my own reality. It was on one of those nights, when the smell of smoke was nearly unbearable, that the worst happened. I was lying in bed trying to sleep, but the heat in the room was suffocating. When I looked over at the nightstand, I saw that the book was on fire. But the flames weren't normal. The pages were burning, but they weren't being consumed. I could see the letters forming amidst the fire, and then, slowly, a shadow began to rise from the pages, taking shape. It was a woman covered in ash, her skin scarred by burns. She started walking towards me, her eyes locked on mine. My body froze with fear. All I could think was that this woman didn't belong to this world, and now she was here in my room. I couldn't move. She kept getting closer, inch by inch, until the smell of smoke became unbearable. When I finally managed to move, my first instinct was to get rid of the book. With trembling hands, I grabbed it and rushed to the fireplace, throwing it into the flames, hoping it would finally burn to ashes. But to my horror, the book didn't burn. The flames just wouldn't touch it. It was like the fire was avoiding it, creating a barrier around it. In that moment, I realized getting rid of that book wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. After that night, I had only one option left: return the book. The next day, I went back to the seller's house, but when I got there, I found the door locked and no response to my knocks. It was as if he had vanished, like he had never existed. With no other choice, I left the book on his doorstep and walked away, trying to forget everything. But forgetting wasn't easy. Even without the book, the smell of smoke still lingers around me, and sometimes at night, I wake up with the feeling that she's back, standing next to my bed, waiting.